Thanks so much, Chris. I'm so pleased to be here. So the findings I'm going to present are a little bit different from Bryan's, but I think largely complementary and kind of confirm some of the takeaways that Bryan shared. So the data I'm sharing is from a nationally representative survey sample of teachers and principals across the United States. It's the RAND American Educator Panels. And I'm going to be sharing some results from 2 surveys in May that we gave to those educators on those panels, and then results from an October survey. Participants were randomly selected to participate in these surveys, and the results have been weighted to be nationally representative. And in the spring, we also have some state representative data that I'm going to share on one of the slides. So I'm really going to be focusing on 3 main trends from the large amount of data we collected. And again, really complementary with some of the things that Bryan talked about. One is that students are falling through the cracks, and we'll talk more about who those students are. And the second is internet access is likely exacerbating those who fall through the cracks. And then lastly, there are large disparities in who is getting remote versus in-person learning. And I'll talk a little bit about why that matters. So first, I'm going to focus on who is falling through the cracks. And when I say falling through the cracks, I mean that according to teachers, there were many students who were not participating in any schoolwork in the spring when schools were closed and aren't attending school now. And those teachers who reported those results were more likely to come from schools with more students of color, more high poverty students. So this is data from the spring. And in the spring, when schools were closed, but most schools were undertaking remote learning, we asked teachers whether they were able to contact all or almost all your students. So you can see here that roughly half of teachers in secondary schools, in schools with more non-white students, in schools with more high poverty families, indicated not being able to contact all or most all their students. So these are students who likely didn't participate in school at all, although they may be have been doing some at-home learning. So the best comparison point we can make with our October survey data and this spring data is probably average daily attendance. We asked teachers in the fall to estimate the percentage of their students who were attending school on a typical school day. Overall, teachers in our survey in October estimated that about 86% of their students were attending school on a given day. So that's down from about 94% in a typical school year, based on National Center for Education Statistics data. So let's put that in real numbers. If there were about 53 million K-12 students in the US, before the pandemic, about 50 million of them showed up on a typical school day. But this fall, between about 45 and 46 million are showing up on a typical school day. So that's a difference of 4 to 5 million kids who aren't learning at school, whether school be remote, hybrid, in person, but would likely be doing so in a typical school year. And of course, teachers' estimates of average daily attendance are lower in high poverty schools, lower in schools with more non-white students. They're also lower for schools that are remote. So teachers' estimates of the percentage of students attending school when they're in person is about 91%, still down from a typical school year. Whereas for teachers who are remote or hybrid, that percentage is about 84 to 85%. So when I say that some students are falling through the cracks, those are the students I'm talking about. Next slide, please. So this next slide captures the second trend that's important to keep in mind, and that is internet access is likely influencing those who fall through the cracks. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but I'd like you to just hone in on the black dots. That's the percentage of teachers who estimated that all or nearly all their students had access to the internet from home, not even high-speed internet access, which is really critical, but just internet access. You can see that the national average is about 50% of teachers, but internet access varies a great deal by state. So in Rhode Island, about 80% of teachers indicated most all their students have internet access. In Mississippi, 20% said the same. But a second important trend here is the school poverty trend. Average estimates of internet access for teachers in high poverty schools in each state are captured by that dark red line. And average estimates of internet access for teachers in the lowest poverty schools in each state are captured by that dark blue line. So these estimates show that poverty has a lot to do with internet access, regardless of state. Of course, urbanicity also likely plays a role, but state and poverty play big roles. So even in a state with more internet access like Rhode Island, teachers in the highest poverty schools have comparable internet access for their students to those in the lowest poverty schools in Tennessee. So why does that matter? We know it matters from research, but we also know it matters intuitively, right? Students will not be able to see their teachers in virtual settings if they don't have access to the internet. They won't have access to the huge volume of information on the internet unless they can go to a public space with internet access. All these are barriers to student engagement, student learning. But our data also provides some explicit evidence on why internet access matters. Next slide, please. So this slide provides evidence of the relationship between, on one hand, the percentage of teachers indicating that most of their students had access to the internet, and their estimates on the y-axis of whether 75% or more of their students were completing assignments. So you can see that this relationship is pretty linear. When teachers estimated lower access to the internet in a particular state, they were also, on average, less likely to indicate that their students were completing assignments. So how this plays out is that in Rhode Island, about 70% of teachers indicated that the great majority of their students were completing assignments. Whereas if you look at Mississippi, Louisiana, between 1/4 and 1/3 of teachers said that most of their students were completing assignments. And this relationship holds up even when you account for other variables like school urbanicity, percentage of students of color, high poverty students, grade level. So even if a teacher is from a school with more poverty, more students of color, if their students have access to the internet, they will have a greater likelihood of completing assignments. So this brings me to the last trend I'll talk about, and that's disparities in who's getting remote versus in-person learning. And this is very similar to what Bryan already reported. So next slide, please. So this is based on surveys to principals in schools that are from principals in our surveys. So principals in schools that were in person as of October were more likely to report that they were in person if they were from lower poverty schools, and more likely to be in schools with more white students. So for example, about 11% of principals in the highest poverty schools reported that their instruction was fully in person, whereas about 56% of these principals reported instruction was remote. Similarly, while about 7% of principals in schools with the highest percentages of students of color indicated providing fully in-person instruction, 63% of principals in those schools indicated they were fully remote. Of course, these trends are connected to urbanicity. High poverty schools are often in urban areas where schools are more likely to be closed. But these data kind of clarify that students of color and those from the highest poverty families are more likely to be receiving remote instruction. And this matters because of internet access. It matters because students are less likely to show up when they're remote, less likely to receive engaging learning experiences that come with being in person. So I'm just going to show one last slide here. Next slide, please. That illustrates how these inequities are playing out. And again, we're looking at assignment completion, but this time we're looking at the percentage of students that teachers estimated were completing assignments this fall. So you see here that assignment completion is tied to whether teachers reported students were fully in person or remote. So teachers in fully remote settings estimated that about 62% of their students were completing assignments versus 82% of students of teachers in fully in-person settings. Hybrid teachers in hybrid settings fall somewhere in between that. We also see that the percentage of students completing assignments is lower in city settings, lower in higher poverty settings, lower in schools with more students of color. Of course, all these trends are intertwined. But if these teachers are providing accurate data, and there's no reason to think they're not, these findings are pretty stark. They indicate that students who most need support are not able to fully participate in learning this fall, and as Bryan's data suggested, will fall further behind. There are lots of implications I can talk about here when we get to the Q&A, but these data suggest that we need to be doing everything we can to get students into classrooms, but at the same time, when it isn't possible, right now in many places, because of the risk of COVID-19 infections, then we need to be putting as much funding as we can into getting students online. This isn't just a COVID problem. The digital divide has been with us a long time. So anything we can do now to support universal broadband access at this crisis point for US schools, we think it'll benefit children and families down the road. So thank you for letting me share this data.
All right, Tyler, keep the slides up for 1 second. I just want to ask 2 kind of quick definitions questions of you before we move on, Julia. So Tyler, go back 1 slide. Just the definitions of the FRLP. Tell us what that means.
Yep, so we defined highest poverty schools as those where 75% or more of students were eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So that's how we defined high poverty for these slides.
Okay, and then go back to the, Tyler, go back 2 more slides. To these slides on the state-by-state internet access question. I'm curious for our reporters out there, where does this state-by-state data come from, and is it accessible to reporters?
So there's great broadband access data from places like Common Sense, which is an organization that focuses on digital access for children and youth. These data came from our surveys. So we asked teachers to estimate whether all or nearly all their students have access to the internet at home. So these are the results on teachers about their students. So it's a slightly different picture, and it's a kind of a by teacher picture as opposed to a by student picture. And Common Sense Media also provides some similar information, and their state by state information is very similar to what we provide.
Okay, and are your data, are your data available for download, or you make it available to the public at large?
Thanks for asking that, Chris. Yeah, we do. We feel like it's a great resource for others. We have a data portal on the American Educator Panel website, and you can download and statistically analyze the COVID data from the spring and the fall. We've put it up for everyone to use for free. There are also restricted access data files that provide more information about student demographics and teacher demographics, but the general data is there, and it contains a lot of really useful variables for analyses.